I never imagined my life would turn into one of those tragic stories you read about online until the night I found out my wife had betrayed me. They say betrayal comes softly, creeping in through the cracks of trust you never thought to fortify. I had always believed my marriage was unbreakable. Sarah and I had been together for nearly a decade, 8 years of marriage, 2 of dating before that. We had built a life together, something stable, something real. Or so I thought. Looking back, the signs had been there. The late nights when Sarah would say she was visiting a friend. The way she'd leave the room to take certain phone calls, lowering her voice just enough to make sure I wouldn't overhear. The sudden shift, small at first, barely noticeable, but there. She kissed me less, touched me less. I told myself it was stress. Work had been demanding, and we had talked about trying for a baby. I figured she had a lot on her mind. I was such a fool. That night, everything changed. I had just gotten home from work. It was a long day, one of those grueling 12-hour shifts that left my body aching for rest. I stepped through the door, expecting the comforting warmth of home, but something felt off the moment I entered. Sarah was in the kitchen, cooking dinner. Her back was to me, her long blonde hair tied up in a messy bun. She was humming softly to herself, but it wasn't the casual, thoughtless tune she usually hummed. It was too deliberate, too forced. I frowned but shook off the feeling. "Hey, babe," I called, setting my keys down on the counter. She turned with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey. How was work?" I shrugged. "Long, draining. The usual." She nodded, stirring whatever was in the pan. "I made your favorite steak and mashed potatoes. That should have made me happy. But instead, it made me suspicious. It wasn't our anniversary. It wasn't my birthday. Sarah wasn't the type to randomly go out of her way to cook my favorite meal unless there was a reason." "Thanks," I said, watching her carefully. "That's really thoughtful." She waved it off with a laugh, but I noticed the tension in her shoulders. "You work so hard. You deserve it." I walked over, placing a hand on her lower back, but she stiffened at my touch. A small thing. Barely perceptible. But it was enough to send a sharp, uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. Then my phone buzzed. A single vibration. One message. I glanced at the screen, expecting it to be a work email or some spam notification. Instead, an unknown number stared back at me. "You should know what your wife has been doing behind your back. Check the photos." For a moment, I didn't move. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then, almost mechanically, I clicked on the attachment. The images loaded slowly, as if fate wanted to give me time to brace for what was coming. The first picture appeared. Sarah. Her hands wrapped around someone's shoulders. A man. His face was turned slightly, but even before I saw his features, my gut already knew. James. My best friend. My stomach twisted violently, while rising in my throat as I swiped to the next image. This time, it was clearer. James' hands were on Sarah's waist. Their lips were inches apart. The dim lighting suggested it wasn't in public, but in a hotel room or someone's home. I kept scrolling. Each image was a fresh wound. A new betrayal carved into my soul. Sarah's head tilted back, her mouth open in laughter as James whispered something into her ear. The way she used to laugh with me. The way she used to look at me. I felt the phone shake in my grip. It took me a second to realize it wasn't the device trembling. It was my hand. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering against my ribcage. My vision blurred at the edges. I felt like I had been punched in the gut, like all the air had been ripped from my lungs. Sarah had cheated on me. And not with some stranger. Not with a coworker I'd never met. With James. The man I had trusted more than anyone outside my marriage. My best friend. My brother in everything. I forced myself to breathe. I needed to think. I needed to be sure. Maybe these pictures were old. Maybe this was some sick joke. I clicked on the details. The timestamps were recent, just 3 nights ago. A Friday night. My mind raced. What was Sarah doing last Friday? Then it clicked. She had told me she was meeting her friend Amanda for dinner. She even sent me a text when she got home late, saying the restaurant had been packed. A lie. A carefully crafted, convincingly delivered lie. I clenched my jaw, my teeth grinding together. My entire body was tense, rigid with fury. Sarah turned from the stove, looking at me with concern. "You okay, honey? You look pale." I forced myself to look at her. Really look at her. The woman I had loved. The woman I had built my world around. And now, all I saw was a stranger. I swallowed, my throat dry. Yeah, I lied. I just need a minute. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, my movements robotic. Up the stairs. Down the hall. Into the bathroom. I locked the door behind me, gripping the edge of the sink as I stared at my reflection. My chest rose and fell rapidly, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. I wanted to scream. To punch something. To break everything in sight. Instead, I did nothing. I just stood there, the images burning into my skull. Sarah. James. The betrayal. The deception. The sheer audacity of it all. I had spent years believing in love. In commitment. In loyalty. I had trusted Sarah with everything I was. And she had thrown it all away. A bitter laugh escaped my lips, but it was hollow. Emotionless. I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I stood in the bathroom, gripping the edges of the sink so hard my knuckles turned white. My breathing was uneven, my thoughts moving too fast to keep up with. I stared at my reflection. My face looked different, as if the betrayal had already started changing me. I checked the photos again. The time stamps. The details. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't someone playing a cruel joke. Sarah and James had been together behind my back. The reality of it settled into my bones, cold and unrelenting. My mind started piecing things together. The night Sarah said she was out with friends. The times James had been distant, almost guilty looking. The way Sarah's phone had become something she guarded more closely over the last few months. I had ignored it all, convinced myself there was nothing wrong. Now I saw it for what it was. I took a deep breath and unlocked the door. I couldn't stay in the bathroom forever. Sarah was downstairs, acting like nothing had happened, like she hadn't betrayed me in the worst possible way. I had to decide how to handle this. When I walked into the kitchen, she was plating the food. She looked up and smiled. "You sure you're okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Her voice was light, casual. I studied her face, looking for any sign that she felt guilty. There was nothing. No hesitation, no shame. If she had any idea what I knew, she was hiding it well. I forced myself to nod. "Yeah. Just tired." She set my plate down at the table and sat across from me. "You should take some time off work. You've been pushing yourself too hard." I picked up my fork, but I had no appetite. My stomach felt tight, twisted. "Yeah," I said, not really listening. Sarah started talking about her day. Something about a coworker being annoying, something about a sale at one of the stores she liked. She spoke like everything was normal. Like nothing had changed. I felt my fingers tighten around the fork. I wanted to ask her about Friday night. I wanted to hear what lie she would come up with if I confronted her without warning. But I forced myself to stay quiet. I needed to be smart about this. If I accused her outright, she might deny it. She might find a way to twist it. I needed more than photos. I needed to hear her admit it. I finished eating in silence. She didn't seem to notice how quiet I was. Or maybe she did and just didn't care. After dinner, she went to shower. I waited until I heard the water running before I grabbed her phone. She used to leave it on the counter without a second thought, but lately, she had been more careful. Tonight, she was careless. I unlocked it easily. She had never changed the password. I went straight to her messages. There were no texts from James. Not a single one. It didn't make sense. She had to be talking to him somehow. I checked her call log. Nothing there either. Then I opened her social media apps. And there it was. A hidden chat. Messages between her and James, all through an app she rarely used. I scrolled through them, reading every word. They had been careful. No names, no obvious details. But it was clear what was happening. They talked about meeting up, about sneaking around, about how I didn't suspect a thing. I kept scrolling. Weeks of messages. Maybe months. Then I saw the most recent one. Friday, 11:42 p.m. James, I can still smell you on me. Sarah, you're bad. James, you love it. Sarah, I do. I stared at the words, feeling something inside me crack. The shower was still running upstairs. I put the phone back exactly where I found it and walked outside. I needed air, space, something to keep me from doing something I couldn't take back. I stood in the driveway, staring at the night sky. I wasn't sure how long I was out there. My mind kept replaying everything. The messages. The photos. The betrayal. Eventually, I went back inside. Sarah was in the living room, sitting on the couch with a blanket around her. She looked up and smiled. Where'd you go? I sat down in the chair across from her. Just needed some air. She nodded, turning her attention back to the TV. Some show she liked was on, but I wasn't watching. I was looking at her, really looking at her. I had loved this woman. I had trusted her. I had built a life with her. And now I had to sit here, pretending like everything was fine, knowing she had given herself to someone else. To James. I clenched my jaw and leaned back in the chair. This wasn't over yet. I barely slept that night. Sarah lay beside me, breathing steadily, completely unaware of the storm building inside me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the messages, the pictures, the evidence of everything she had done. My mind kept replaying all the moments I had trusted her, all the times she had looked me in the eye and lied. I stared at the ceiling in the darkness, listening to the sound of her breathing. I wanted answers. I wanted to hear her admit what she had done. I wanted to see if she would keep lying when she knew I had proof. The next morning, I waited. I watched her move around the house, acting like everything was normal. She made coffee, checked her phone, smiled at me like nothing was wrong. I almost laughed at how easily she could pretend. I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to let this drag on. When she sat down at the table with her coffee, I placed my phone in front of her. Look at it. She frowned, confused. What? Look at the screen. She hesitated, then glanced down. The pictures were pulled up, the ones I had been sent. The ones that showed her and James together. She stared at them, her face completely still. I watched her reaction closely. No immediate denial, no gasp of shock. Just silence. Then she looked up at me. Where did you get these? Her voice was calm. Too calm. Not the reaction of someone who had been falsely accused. That's your response? I asked, my voice steady. Not this isn't what it looks like? Not I can explain? She swallowed. Who sent these to you? Does it matter? She exhaled slowly, looking down at the table. She didn't speak for a long time. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to figure out what to say. I didn't give her the chance. I know everything, I said. The messages. The calls. The meetings. I checked your phone last night. Her eyes snapped up to meet mine. Now there was emotion, fear, maybe, or anger. You went through my phone? I almost laughed at that. That's what you're upset about? She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. Don't lie to me, I said, my voice sharper now. I want the truth. She hesitated. Then, finally, she nodded. Yes. A simple word, but it felt like a boulder. I clenched my jaw, my hands tightening into fists under the table. I had known. I had seen the proof. But hearing her admit it was something else entirely. How long? She looked away. Does it matter? Of course it matters. She sighed. A few months. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. How did it start? I asked. She hesitated again. It just happened. I shook my head. Nothing just happens. You made a choice. She didn't respond. I leaned forward. Tell me. How did it start? She rubbed her temples. James and we got close. I don't know when it crossed the line. It wasn't planned. I could feel my pulse pounding in my head. And all those nights you told me you were out with friends? You were with him? She didn't answer, but she didn't have to. Did you ever feel guilty? I asked. She looked at me now, her expression conflicted. Of course I did. Not enough to stop. She didn't say anything. I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my anger in check. And what about him? Was this some kind of game for him? Or was it something more? She hesitated again, and that hesitation told me everything. I laughed bitterly. You love him. She looked down, not denying it. I clenched my jaw. You've been lying to me for months. Coming home to me, sleeping next to me, pretending everything was fine. Tears welled in her eyes. I didn't mean for it to happen. That's the second time you've said that. Like it was out of your control. Like it wasn't a choice. She wiped at her face. I don't expect you to understand. I let out a slow breath. So what now? Are you planning to leave me for him? She shook her head. I don't know. I stared at her in disbelief. You don't know? She looked at me with a pained expression. I love you. But I love him too. I felt something inside me snap. I pushed back from the table, standing up. You don't get to say that. You don't get to stand here and tell me you love me after what you've done. She flinched at the anger in my voice. I didn't want to hurt you. I let out a humorless laugh. Then you shouldn't have done it. She wiped at her face again, but I felt nothing. No sympathy, no sadness. Just a cold, detached anger. I turned away, walking toward the door. Where are you going? She asked. I stopped but didn't look back. I don't know. Then I walked out, leaving her sitting at the table, alone with the mess she had created. I walked through the streets, my mind racing with everything that had happened. The weight of betrayal pressed down on me, tightening around my chest with each step. The cold air barely registered against my skin. My thoughts were too loud, my emotions too raw. I wanted justice. I wanted him to feel even a fraction of what I was feeling. James had taken everything I gave him, years of friendship, loyalty, trust, and tossed it aside like it meant nothing. And Sarah? The woman I had committed my life to? She had been right there with him, lying to my face every single day. They had made a fool out of me. And I wasn't going to let it go unanswered. I pulled out my phone and stared at James' contact. My fingers hovered over the screen before pressing the call button. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up. Hey, man, what's up? The sound of his voice sent a sharp, burning anger through me. He was calm. Too calm. Like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't been sleeping with my wife behind my back. "We need to talk," I said, my voice even. There was a pause. A long one. Then he sighed. "She told you." I clenched my jaw. "I found out myself." Another pause. Then, finally, "Listen, No," I cut him off. "You don't talk yet. You're going to meet me. Tonight. The place we always go." He hesitated. "I don't think that's a good idea." "I don't care what you think," I said, my tone sharp. "You owe me this much." There was silence on the other end. Then, reluctantly, he said, "Fine." I hung up without another word. I walked back home, my hands curled into fists. My heart pounded with a mix of fury and adrenaline. I had no plan, no strategy. But I knew one thing for certain: James was going to regret this. When I entered the house, Sarah was still sitting at the kitchen table. She looked up immediately, her face pale. "Where did you go?" I ignored the question. "I'm fixing this." She stood up, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "What does that mean?" I didn't answer. I walked past her, heading for the bedroom. She followed me, her footsteps quick. "You're going to see him, aren't you?" I opened the dresser and pulled out a fresh shirt. I changed without acknowledging her. "Say something," she pleaded. I turned to face her. "Why do you care?" Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. "You made your choice," I said. "Now I'm making mine." Her eyes filled with something between fear and desperation. "Conversation with him won't change anything." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "And what do you suggest? That we just forget this ever happened? That we pretend like everything's fine?" She shook her head. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve that. But please, don't do something you'll regret." I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "The only thing I regret is trusting you." Her face crumpled, but I didn't care. I grabbed my jacket and walked out the door. The meeting place was an empty parking lot near the edge of town. It was where we used to meet up after work, drink a few beers, talk about life. It had been a place of friendship, of brotherhood. Now, it was something else. James was already there, leaning against his car, arms crossed. He looked tense, his jaw tight. He knew what was coming. I walked toward him, stopping a few feet away. "You wanted to talk," he said cautiously. "So talk." I didn't answer. He took a breath, straightening. "I know I screwed up." I clenched my fists. "Screwed up? That's what you call it?" He exhaled. "Look, I didn't mean for it to happen." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Funny." That's exactly what she said. His face darkened. "I don't expect you to forgive me." "Good. Because I won't." He shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair. "It wasn't just about." I stepped closer. "Be careful what you say next." He hesitated, then sighed. "I'm sorry." The words meant nothing. "You didn't just betray me," I said. "You destroyed everything." "And for what?" He looked down. "I don't know." "Liar." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "I trusted you," I said. "You were my best friend." He nodded slowly. "I know. You don't exist to me anymore," I said. "Stay away from me. Stay away from Sarah." He nodded again. "I will." I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. When I got home, Sarah was sitting on the couch, her hands gripping her knees. She looked up as soon as I walked in. "Is it over?" I didn't answer. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a drink. She stood and walked toward me, her movements hesitant. "Did you were in conflict?" I took a slow sip before answering. Not as much as he deserved. She exhaled, looking relieved. Thank you. I set the glass down. Don't thank me. She swallowed. I know I have no right to ask anything from you. But I don't want to lose you. I stared at her. You already did. She blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. Can we fix this? I let the silence stretch between us. Then I shook my head. No. Her face crumpled, and she nodded slowly. I understand. I finished my drink and walked past her. I was done talking. The air inside the house felt different now. Heavier. The kind of silence that stretched, pressing down like a weight neither of us could ignore. I sat in the living room, hands resting on my knees, watching Sarah as she stood by the kitchen counter. Her arms were wrapped around herself, her body tense, like she was bracing for something she knew was coming but still wasn't ready to face. She had been crying. I could see it in the redness of her eyes, the uneven rise and fall of her chest. But I felt nothing for it. There had been a time when seeing her cry would have made me want to fix things, to make her feel better. That time was gone. She turned to me slowly. What happens now? The question was pointless, but I knew why she asked. She wanted to know if there was still a chance. If there was still something left between us. I leaned back in the chair, exhaling through my nose. That depends. Her voice wavered. On what? I stared at her. On whether you're finally ready to tell me the truth. She swallowed. I already told you the truth. No, I said, shaking my head. You told me facts. That it happened. That it was a mistake. That you didn't mean for it to go this far. That's not the truth. That's just damage control. She flinched. I don't know what else to say. I studied her carefully. Try saying why you did it. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She wasn't ready to answer. Tell me why you decided to betray me, I said, my voice level. Her fingers clenched the edge of the counter. I don't know why. That's a lie, I said without hesitation. Her breathing picked up. It's not. Yes, it is, I interrupted. You knew exactly what you were doing. You just never thought you'd get caught. Her face crumpled slightly, but she forced herself to hold it together. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I let out a sharp breath. You keep saying that like it means something. Like it somehow changes what you did. You weren't thinking about me at all, Sarah. Not when you were with him. Not when you were sneaking around. You didn't care about what this would do to me. You only care now because I found out. Tears filled her eyes, but I wasn't done. You had a choice, I said, my voice growing colder. You could have told me you were unhappy. You could have told me you wanted something else. But instead, you looked me in the eye every single day and lied. She wiped her face quickly, shaking her head. I didn't want to lose you. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Then you shouldn't have thrown me away. Her shoulders shook as she inhaled sharply. It wasn't like that. Then explain it to me, I said, my tone sharp. Because from where I'm sitting, you had everything. A husband who loved you. A life we built together. And that still wasn't enough. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. That's what I thought, I said. A long silence stretched between us. She wasn't crying anymore. She was just looking at me like she didn't recognize the person sitting in front of her. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. So, do you love him? She hesitated. That hesitation was enough of an answer. I nodded. That's all I needed to know. She panicked then. I love you too, she said quickly, her voice breaking. I never stopped. I met her eyes. That's not love, Sarah. Love isn't lying to someone's face. Love isn't making a fool out of the person who trusts you the most. What you felt for me died the moment you decided to sleep with him. She shook her head violently. No, I never wanted to lose you. You already did. Tears slid down her cheeks. Please, don't say that. I sat back, exhaling slowly. Are you still seeing him? She blinked rapidly, caught off guard by the question. What? Did you stop? I asked, my voice hard. She hesitated again. A bitter smile crossed my face. So, even after I found out, even after I confronted you, you still couldn't let him go. She let out a shaky breath. I didn't know what to do. You knew exactly what to do, I said. You just didn't want to. She covered her mouth with her hand, her whole body shaking now. Save it, I cut her off. I've heard enough. Her hands fell to her sides. So that's it? I nodded slowly. That's it. She wiped at her face again. Are you going to leave me? I took a long moment before answering. I don't see any reason to stay. Her breath caught. But. I held up a hand, stopping her. No. You don't get to ask me for anything. Not after this. She covered her face with her hands, nodding through her tears. I understand. I stood up. I'll give you a few days to figure out what you want to do. I'll stay somewhere else until then. Panic flashed in her eyes. Where will you go? That's none of your concern. She stepped forward slightly, then stopped herself. I don't want this to be the end. It already is. She let out a soft, broken sound, pressing her hands to her chest. Please don't hate me. I looked at her, taking in the face of the woman I had loved for so many years. The woman who had destroyed everything with a single choice. I don't hate you, I said finally. I just don't care anymore. She shut her eyes, her body trembling. I turned away, grabbed my keys, and walked out the door. I didn't look back. I drove aimlessly for hours, letting the road stretch before me without any particular destination in mind. The streetlights passed in a steady rhythm, their glow casting long shadows across the empty streets. I had no music playing, no distractions, just the low hum of the engine and the thoughts running through my head. Sarah was behind me now. The house we had shared, the years we had built together, it was all in the past. The moment I walked out that door, something shifted inside me. I wasn't the same man who had trusted her, who had believed in the future we had planned. That version of me was gone. But what came next? I didn't have an answer. At some point, I found myself on the outskirts of town, pulling into a small roadside motel. The neon vacancy sign flickered unevenly, buzzing softly in the night air. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few scattered cars. I stepped inside, the scent of old carpet and cheap air freshener filling my nose. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up as I slid my card across the counter and took the key to my room. I didn't bother with small talk. I just wanted to be alone. The room was exactly what I expected, dim lighting, a bed that looked like it had seen better days, and a TV remote missing its back cover. None of it mattered. I wasn't here for comfort. I just needed space. I dropped my bag onto the chair and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone. Messages from Sarah kept coming in. A dozen missed calls, all ignored. I scrolled through them, not reading the words, just noting the sheer volume. Apologies. Regrets. Desperate pleas for me to come back. I deleted them all. Then I blocked her number. I wasn't interested in what she had to say. There was nothing she could say that would change anything. She had made her choices. Now, she had to live with them. James had called me once. No message. I blocked him, too. These people didn't exist to me anymore. For the first time in days, the rage that had consumed me began to settle into something else, clarity. I wasn't looking for revenge anymore. That part was done. Now, I just wanted to move forward. But where? I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. I had spent years building a life with Sarah. My entire routine had revolved around her, our house, our plans, our future. Without that, I was left with nothing but questions. What did I want? Where did I go from here? I pulled up my bank app, checking my balance. I had savings. More than enough to leave town, to start over somewhere new. The thought settled in my mind, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, I felt something that almost resembled peace. I didn't have to stay here. I didn't have to rebuild anything in the same place where my life had been torn apart. I could walk away. Really walk away. The idea felt right. I pulled up a list of apartments in another city, hours from here. A fresh start. A place where no one knew me, where I wouldn't run into people who knew about my past. Somewhere I could reclaim my life on my own terms. I booked a place. A small apartment. Temporary, but enough. That was it. Decision made. I packed my bag again. I hadn't unpacked much, but I didn't intend to stay another night in this motel. By the time the sun rose, I was already back on the road, heading toward a future that no longer included Sarah or James. I wasn't running away. I was moving forward. And I wasn't looking back.